All right, music fans, welcome back. Harmless Dave here, talking real music in real time for a few real people out there just like you and just like me. All right, going to be promoting this album off and on. It is Chris Rosender, The Monster Inside. This is a holy crap Batman kind of album. High on Love is just an incredible song, but you got to go listen to the entire thing, courtesy of Pride and Joy Music. It's got some Toto-ish qualities in it, and when you when you can't figure out what band it sounds like, it kind of sounds like Toto or Journey, right? But no, this is really well done. I had one patron, John, on my page who is really sharp, and he said, High on Love, that could be the best song I've heard so far in 2023. New song, that is. Chris Rosender. Check it out. I think you're going to like it. Also, please check out Modern Retro Radio, modernretrofm.com. You won't be disappointed, playing music that you won't hear anywhere else. They play classic artists who are coming out with new material. What a crazy idea that is, huh? People who can't get the time of day inside of the iHeart radio industrial complex, which has no creativity, and just hearing the same songs over and over again. You'll probably hear Hold On Loosely today. That's it. You'll hear Hold On Loosely. You know who wasn't holding on loosely to his career back in the early 1980s? Peter Cetera. Now, I believe Peter Cetera performed like a soft coup on Chicago. Maybe not intentionally. Maybe that wasn't his master plan, because Peter was one of those guys who really lacked self-confidence back in the 70s. But then he writes this song. You might remember this tune called If You Leave Me Now. And the band, they didn't want to become a ballad band. They let Peter record it. Like, okay, Peter, you can record your little ballad. It'll be all right. And then the song goes number one, not only number one here in the States, but number one internationally. And all of a sudden, Peter Cetera is like, maybe I can do this stuff after all. See, I think Peter Cetera was the most mainstream guy in Chicago at the beginning. And it took him a number of years to feel comfortable writing a song. And he would write a song and you would hear a difference. You would hear the typical complex, more progressive stuff that the other guys were writing. Although on occasion, like Just You and Me, for instance, the Jimmy Pankow song, you would hear something very mainstream. So you're like, okay, well, now they're trying to write mainstream songs. And here comes Peter Cetera. By the time the 80s are present, the 80s begin and Chicago 14 flops. And Columbia says bye-bye to Chicago. In fact, Peter Cetera also had a solo album he was going to release through Columbia. He had to buy it back in order to put it out with Warner Brothers. He had to buy out the contract, which is pretty weird. But you see what happens next. Peter Cetera puts out this amazing solo album that nobody gets to hear, right? For the most part. Now, if you're an old school rock radio junkie like yours truly, you might remember this song called Livin' in the Limelight. Peter Cetera featuring Steve Lukather on guitar and the great Mike Boddicker playing keyboards. And to me, that was almost a precursor to Don Henley's Dirty Laundry. Now, Dirty Laundry did far better than Livin' in the Limelight, although Livin' in the Limelight hit number 6 on mainstream rock stations. And I think it would have gone all the way to number 1 if it weren't for the fact that the rock guys, the rock programmers were like, we're not putting Peter Cetera on our rock station. That's that schmaltzy ballad guy. Chicago, for some reason, didn't translate all that well, especially at that point in their career, following all of those AM radio songs in the 70s. By the time you get to the 80s, rock stations, they might be playing 25 or 6 to 4, but they're not playing, feeling stronger every day and stuff like that. So Cetera, who's getting in better physical shape and who's thinking to himself, I can do this, puts out this really decent album. And you've got Chris Pinnock, who would later become the guitarist for Chicago, because I think they fired Donnie Dacus right around this time. I don't know, they may have had one other guitarist in between, but Chris Pinnock was the guy who was there for 16 and 17, and then he got fired. Then you had Dwayne Bailey step in. So, I don't know, maybe he got to 18, Chris Pinnock. I'm not sure. It could be 16, 17, 18, but Chris Pinnock tells the story that he got a phone call saying that the band is going to be restructured next year, which basically means I'm fired. So Peter Cetera, who lacked all of that self-confidence that he needed to kind of, branch out on his own, I think discovered all of that self-confidence after he had a couple of #1 records with Chicago and figured, hey, I can do this. So he does this album. The record label kind of, I don't know, they don't do a lot with it because Chicago 16 is about to come out and they didn't want to have the two things competing with one another. Typically, bands really frown upon the lead singer going out and doing his own thing and coming back. Journey was really ticked off at Steve Perry when he did Street Talk, and Neil Schon said something like, sounds kind of like us. This is what we would do. So it's kind of confusing, and the difference though with Peter Cetera is that record did not sound like a Chicago record, especially Living in the Limelight. That was a gritty 1981, cruising down the road late at night rock song with all kinds of great guitar work in there. Lukather just tearing it up, and Michael Boddicker providing some great synthesizer work as he always did. The weird thing is, by the time you get to Chicago 16, some of that Cetera production comes along, even though the sound that Foster creates is much more adult contemporary. But David Foster, you really can't argue with his instincts as the band gets to #1 for the first time in a number of years. And again, Peter Cetera is there writing really decent songs. And if you listen to Peter Cetera in interviews a few years back, he's complaining a lot about how the other guys in Chicago aren't coming up with anything. And Cetera is coming up with pretty decent songs, and he's bouncing ideas off of David Foster. And even before his partnership with Foster, if you go listen to his solo album, the first one, you're going to find a lot of really good material on there. You're going to hear some pretty decent musicians and musicianship. And I think Chicago had lost a lot of their musical mojo at that point. And Foster brought in a lot of these guys who were playing on other people's records, people like Steve Lukather and Michael Boddicker. And I think that was a real slap in the face to guys like Robert Lamb and guys who were in the horn section who were very loyal to Robert Lamb. But Danny Serafin, who used to be the drummer, who's no longer the drummer in Chicago, and probably should never have been fired, he was 100% on board with the makeover of Chicago. And he liked David Foster, and he was okay with giving Peter Cetera, more leeway to go out there and create. It did make Chicago a completely different band, but it's hard to argue with the success of Chicago 16 and especially Chicago 17. And really, the genesis of all this was Peter Cetera's first solo album. And one of the reasons Cetera ends up leaving Chicago is because he wants to do another solo album. And this time he wants the record label to promote it. And the guys in the band are like, well, no, wait a minute. We're really successful here. So they're on Peter's coattails, and they're lecturing Peter now, who helped create all of this success. They're saying, hey, we don't want you to leave, and we're still a faceless, nameless band. And they're doing documentaries about how, they don't really have a lead singer. I don't know, go back to the 1970s. You're going to see Peter Cetera most of the time. You might see Robert Lamb on occasion. Maybe Terry Kath now and then. But it was Peter. When they would record a song, most of the time it was Peter who was getting the lead vocal. I mean, they ignored reality. And so when Cetera is trying to bargain with them, he can stay, but he gets to do his thing. It's kind of like Steve Perry did on Raised on Radio. Yeah, I'll hang out, but this is going to be my project. Those guys didn't want to submit to Peter Cetera's authority. I think they would have made a ton more money during the 80s if they had held on. Although they did pretty good with Jason, and they kept some of that momentum going. They had radio success, but they didn't have the same level of album sales once Peter Cetera left. It's like they split the difference. Like, some of the fans went over to Peter, some of the fans stayed with Chicago because they were just loyal to the brand. And a few people ended up really liking Jason Scheff, and I was one of those people. I enjoyed the Jason and Bill era. But if you had a couple of more albums, at least with Bill and Peter on them, I mean, I don't know why you wouldn't have continued success, even into the 1990s, because I think you overcome some of the nonsense in the music industry with the sheer power of those two voices and super well-written songs. You bring Diane Warren in with both Bill and Peter is still singing great, by the way, well into the 90s and beyond. So the way I look at it is Peter more or less started the breakup with Chicago when he did that first album. And he showed, number one, that he was a legitimate songwriter. Number two, he could sing a completely different style and just absolutely kill it. In fact, I think the song would have done better if it wasn't Peter Cetera on the single, if it was some other artist. But look, Peter was a well-known quantity at that point, and to have Steve Lukather laying down this amazing guitar solo, I don't know. I just think of like Dirty Laundry by Don Henley. It's kind of like this song, Living in the Limelight. It's a bit like Dirty Laundry Jr., Not quite as experimental, but still very different for that time period, and sounds good today. It doesn't sound dated. It sounds hard rock capable. We'll say that. But anyway, Cetera took one song that he had and left the band. And that song, of course, was Glory of Love. And he did some more writing, and he came up with a full album of material. I'm thinking if everybody had stayed together, Chicago 18 with the material that was on that, which was really, really good, but with Cetera and Champlin still in place after Chicago 17, it's like you record your biggest album and then you let this guy go. So I think that was a big mistake, but I do think Peter wanted out of there. He was tired of the drugs. He was tired of the mediocre songwriting. He was tired of the dysfunctional nature of it. And yeah, he was definitely tired of doing 100 tour dates or 300 tour dates or how many tour dates they were doing back in those days. He's just tired of it. And I don't blame him. I mean, he had been doing that since the 1960s. And I'm thinking, you know what? You should celebrate your success a little bit and slow down. But even today, Chicago has like 100 dates booked. This year, Robert Lamb, he's like 78 years old. They don't care. They're just, this is the way they're going to go out. And a lot of fans are grateful that they're still out there. But the band is just a mere shadow of their former selves. So, in any event, those are my thoughts on the Peter Cetera not so hostile takeover of Chicago. It started back on that first solo album, and then it progressed, and Peter got his way. And when Peter got his way, the band made a ton of money. And so you got to give Peter credit. David Foster, Danny Seraphin, those are the guys who pulled the strings, and they were right. The band had never been as successful as that time period. Even in the 70s, they weren't quite as big as they were during that 80s revival. So that's my video on that topic. Before I go, it's Chris Rosender, baby. The Monster Inside. This has that vibe of Peter Cetera's debut album a little bit. Maybe, maybe not. Certainly decent hard rocking stuff. It has some Toto-esque qualities. So there's your reference to Steve Lukather. Anyway, folks, thanks for watching. Continue to watch, continue to subscribe, and I will see you soon.